Welcome to the Bestiary, your one-stop shop for monster lore, info, and shenanigans. Join us as we take you through today's special feature.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Morgan. Welcome back to the Bestiary. We are here to talk about orcs this week, and with us, as usual, is Jonathan, our DM.
Hello.
Kavan.
Hey there.
And this week's special guest is Robert Kendzie. Did I pronounce that correctly?
That is correct. Thank you so much.
Hola. Okay, so John, you had a bit of a blurb you wanted to get us started off with, yeah?
Well, first I want to give a bit of an introduction to Robert Kendzie. Mr. Kendzie is a writer, game designer, and a filmmaker. And he's a bit of a personal favorite of ours, the Alignment May Vary group. In a way, you could even say the name Alignment May Vary came about because of Robert Kendzie. Because Robert wrote a campaign called the Tomb of Haggemoth for 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. And I was pointed to this campaign back when I was looking for something good to run to boost my characters and levels so I could get them to the Red Hand of Doom. And somebody on Reddit said, well, there's this thing, and it's kind of like a mix of Goonies meets Indiana Jones. And I thought, well, that sounds intriguing. And I read it, I fell in love with it, and played it thinking this will be a great 5 months little run here. Well, it ended up being a year and a half. And it was a year and a half that, I mean, literally, us and our lives went through changes during that time. But also, I mean, it locked in huge character plot points, and alignments literally shifted from across the spectrum. And so there you go. Alignments may vary, and most of our story has really grown out of that campaign. So we thank Robert for that very much.
Thank you so much.
In addition, Robert's also written a very last book series of supplements for Die 20 systems. The one that I read before this podcast was the very last book about alignment. And that's a very apt title. It is truly the last book about alignment you'll ever need. You will learn more about alignment and literally everything you can do with alignment in your game. And it's also a fascinating read on sort of the psychology of alignment. And we may get into that a little bit today. He's also, his most recent book is Hammer on Stone, which is a collection of dwarven poetry, which that sends tingles from me. I love this. And for the last couple of years, he has been making short films with the Northern Virginia Motion Picture Co-op. And you can see all of his work at diredestiny.com. We'll post a link to that for sure, along with the episode when it comes out. So welcome, Robert Kendzie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
And today's topic is orcs.
Yes.
And my very first question for you is, why orcs?
Ooh, I love orcs. What can I say? They are, the orcs are kind of like the monkey wrench of fantasy monsters, because you could use them in so many different ways. And there's on the old TV Tropes website, there's a trope that's like our elves are different, and that also applies to orcs because everybody's orcs are different too. So you can make your orcs be anything you want. And I think I really fell in love with orcs because I also, in addition to having a role-playing game background, I have a wargaming background, and I really fell in love with Games Workshop's iteration of orcs. The amazing mean green war machine that just kind of like steamrolls everybody with just bloody mindedness and ridiculous tactics, and somehow they just sort of they don't often like win big victories, but somehow they manage to just always stick around.
And they have bad manners while doing it. They
have atrocious manners by human standards. By orc standards, their manners are impeccable.
Well, there's a lot to dive into with orcs today. To give our listeners just a good base to start off of, I'm going to run through just a little bit of history on the orcs of Toril, which is the world of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, the official campaign setting, the Forgotten Realms, just to give everybody a bit of a sense. So first of all, orcs as a design thing, obviously were inspired by Tolkien. And they came out of that and were basically shunted right into Dungeons & Dragons. And in the world of Toril, they had to figure out, well, what's the backstory to these creatures? And what they came up with was during the age of savagery, orcs were actually not native to Toril. They came through in portals that were opened by the creator races thousands of years ago. And they began as kind of feral tribes. And to give people a timeline, this is in Forgotten Realms, everything's done off the Dale Reckoning calendar. This is minus 3,800 Dale Reckoning. So 3,800 years before the Dale Reckoning. So this is ancient history. And the orcs end up, they're feral tribes, but they end up finally getting leadership. And the first thing they do is turn on the world and attack the greatest kingdom of that time, which is the kingdom of Netheril. And noticing that the orcs, if they conquer Netheril, they're poised to conquer the entire world. The elves and the humans and the dwarves all come together in a great conglomerate army, and they fight back the orcish hordes, and especially the elves end up just crushing them, decimating them, breaking them so that they will never be a threat again. And historically, this may be the reason in the Forgotten Realms why orcs hate elves. Although there are religious reasons too. Their great god Grumpsh was supposedly blinded by the elven god Kirillin. But forgetting all that, moving forward sometime, the threat of the orcs seems to be ended until about 2,600 years later, in 1,081 years before the Dale Reckoning, a group of wizards from the Mohalandi kingdom, they get embroiled in this plot to overthrow the government. And as part of that, one of these wizards opens up a portal back to the orc world. And the orcs start pouring through in greater numbers than ever. And they are eager for revenge. And they come in such great numbers that the gods of the Mohalandi Empire actually take physical form to fight back the hordes. But the hordes are so great that they murder the gods. However, in doing so, it turns out killing a god is pretty tiring. So the orcs are sort of left weakened by this, and they are open to attack from another conglomerate of humans, elves, dwarves. And this time they are again beaten back, and they never fully recover from this battle. They never recover this amount of strength again. Doesn't mean they're not a threat, though. The orcs have continued to plague the Forgotten Realms. Probably the most famous modern orc was Obold Many Arrows, who is described in R.A. Salvatore's books. He ends up fighting Brunner Battlehammer and Dritz Duorden, who some of you may be familiar with. And he becomes famous. Morgan's a fan.
I haven't read them since I was a kid, so we'll hold off on that until I do a reread.
Don't reread them. You'll still be a fan. It's fine. Don't think about it.
They were good in high school.
They were very good in high school. But he is kind of famous because he builds this great orc army. He actually establishes the first orc true kingdom and ultimately turns to peace. And his kingdom, the kingdom of Many Arrows, remains to this day. It's had some shaky points. They tried to stage a coup and return to the old ways, but for the most part, it has remained a stable kingdom of peaceful orcs who trade and have commerce and economy with human, elven, dwarven settlements. And that is kind of where we are today in the Forgotten Realms. They have this peaceful kingdom, but bands of orcs still travel the countryside and ravage it. So, lecture over. Just wanted to give you guys that history to give you some into the Forgotten Realms.
So in summary, there's been two great orcish wars. Is that what you were saying?
There's been two world wars
with
orcs, you could say. Yes. But many, 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 many battles beyond that.
It's kind of funny that the Forgotten Realms orcs kind of like parallel, like that history you gave, parallels in a way a little bit of the history of sort of like the development of orcs as a trope, as a creature in the fantasy genre, how they go originally from being this sort of like, this sort of just like evil plague to this massive war machine to a sort of like the redemption of orcs in popular culture where they're just, just another faction now.
Do you want to talk a bit about that? Like where do you see the history kind of beginning and making this transformation?
Yeah, sure. So I did want to talk a little bit about the history of like where orcs come from, and Tolkien more or less in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, he more or less invented what we think of as orcs. So one of the things that's important to know is that, like, so for instance, in The Hobbit, Tolkien uses the word goblin to describe these sort of like evil creatures that are they're humanoid. They have language. They use weapons. They are aggressive and have, sort of like they have tactics and leaders and some kind of a culture. And then in Lord of the Rings, he uses goblins and orcs sort of interchangeably. So that's one of the reasons why we tend to think, or at least some people tend to think of orcs and goblins, myself included, as sort of like within the same sort of realm of sort of the same sort of creature, maybe just two different
family.
Yeah, exactly. Same family of creatures. And for Tolkien originally, so the orcs are very much like the anti-elves. OK, where the elves are, tall and graceful, and, they believe in high culture and art and the preservation of the natural world. Orcs are, sort of like short, brutish. They're aggressive. They are uncouth. They are despoilers of the natural world. They're very much they're very industrial, actually, especially in The Hobbit, too, when Tolkien's like describing what a goblin is. He talks about how they love explosions and things that are very loud and destructive, and that they're responsible for like some of the worst weapons that we see in the world today, and things like that. And
which was a response, right, to his world,
yeah,
what was going on, what he saw happening.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's there are different interpretations that people apply to the orcs in Tolkien. He famously said that he hated allegory. So he didn't want. Yeah, well, he said it, but we're gonna read allegory in anyway. He said he hated allegory, but it's, some people read in sort of like the orcs as an outside invader. I don't really subscribe to that, because I kind of see in the orcs and the elves that's Tolkien's warring ideas in his mind, like two warring aspects of, Western culture, where, you have sort of like, and again, this is all very simplified, and there are Tolkien scholars out there who can do a much, much better job and have much more knowledge than I do on this subject. But, the idea that the sort of like the dichotomy between the elves and the orcs represents sort of like a dichotomy between two aspects of, Western culture, these sort of like the more rural agrarian kind of aspect of the culture focuses on knowledge and learning and art and fellowship. And on the other side, you've got the industrial war machine that is the orcs that are going to trample everything. In
Tolkien's world, weren't orcs like a corruption of elves as well? Like they started off as elves and then were turned into, over like years of like abuse, into the orc.
There's actually, again, because Tolkien never actually sat down and really. There are contradictory notes that have been published from his early works, that stuff that showed up in the Silmarillion. In one version, Melkor, the original, big dark lord enemy of the light, is responsible for creating them, but Tolkien didn't like that because he didn't want evil to be capable of creation. So in another version, which wound up getting more widely published, there is that version of the story where Melkor takes elves and tortures and warps them into becoming the orcs, and they are sort of like these creations of evil. I think they're very much associated with the horrors of industrial war that Tolkien saw in World War I. Because the orcs come from, wherever the orcs go, like you look at Mordor. Mordor, if you read the description of Mordor, this blasted, ruined, awful land that's got big pools of poison standing water and piles of rubble and wreck and ruin everywhere. And that's no man's land. World War I is what he's describing there. And, that's what happens when the orcs get hold of a place and settle in. It becomes that. So I think they very much represented for Tolkien just sort of like the awfulness of in some ways the awfulness of the 20th century that he probably took some issues
Now
with.
that gets ported, all of that really, as just a neat little package into D&D.
Yes,
right?
yeah. So if you go back and look at the early editions of Dungeons and Dragons, so the Gygax and Arneson and the guys who are were the ones who were coming up with Dungeons and Dragons at the time. They were all wargamers. They were guys who were doing historical wargaming, 100 Years' War, Gauls and Romans, that kind of thing. And but they were all, a number of them were big Tolkien fans as well. And so if you're a wargamer, and this is you talk to any wargamer who's at all interested, if there's an interest in wargaming and an interest in Tolkien, you're going to want to do Helm's Deep. You're going to want to do Pelennor Fields. You're going to want to do all of the, these major battles, the Battle of Five Armies. You're going to want to do these battles on the tabletop just as much as for historical buff, if I want to refight Waterloo or the Battle of Inyazane or something like that,
You're right. Those were for a fantasy person. That's our Waterloo, right?
Exactly.
I mean, Helm's Deep is
Helm's Deep, yes,
the great.
Absolutely. Helm's Deep is more our Rorke's Drift, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you what Napoleon did,
For
but I
sure.
can definitely tell you everything that happened at Helm's Deep.
There we go. Yeah, exactly. And at the time, there's nobody's making orc miniatures at the time. They're making, all kinds of other things. But you know what? You take a Saracen and you paint him green and you put some little white paint there for tusks and hey, you got an orc, and that's basically how that starts. So converting or just like saying, okay, so these guys over here are the orcs and these guys over here are the forces of Gondor or the Rohirrim or whatnot. And so they were playing variations of a wargaming system, which later became known as Chainmail. And the first step towards D&D was Gary Gygax writing a supplement for Chainmail, which I used to have a copy of a long time ago. I lost it. Got lost in a move.
One of the
somewhere.
originals?
Not one of the originals. It was a reprint from the 80s, but
still, that's great.
But he basically is this supplement where it's like, so here's the rules for Chainmail, and here's the rules if you want to add dragons, wizards, orcs, and what they called heroes and superheroes was a term, so like this, amazing. So that'd be your Aragorn or your Boromir or whatnot. And then that when they developed Dungeons and Dragons, this idea of, orcs and other humanoid creatures coming in to the game is, just sort of like seems natural to them because they're taking existing miniatures, converting them basically to represent these monstrous creatures. And the reason that orcs, work, sort of like come into the game this way is because, in wargaming, you want an enemy that uses weapons, that uses tactics, that is militaristic. So it makes sense that when the orcs come in, that's what they look like. They use tactics. They're militaristic. They're highly aggressive. You want bad guys to fight, basically. So then they come in as in some ways, the generic bad guys. And there's a whole treadmill of what at the time were called evil demi-humans. No one really uses that terminology. It's a very old school term. But
it makes me uncomfortable a little.
Yeah, no,
oh.
exactly. It does. And but like this,
it's like that's what my grandparents called me.
I have a copy somewhere of the old module, The Keep on the Borderlands, which is a very famous, one of the original D&D modules. And that right there shows more than anything sort of the treadmill of evil demi-humans, where you start with kobolds, then you go to goblins, then hobgoblins, then orcs, then bugbears, and gnolls or whatever, and just like you sort of like work your way up the scale because, at first level, you don't want to be fighting you don't want to be fighting powerful things. At first level, you got to have weedy things to fight. And then as you grow up in level, it makes less sense to fight the weedy things anymore. So they wanted to have stats for every level of evil demi-human that you would encounter. And this is where the whole, always evil alignment stuff starts happening right there, because they want to have these creatures that are, their function in the game. All right, so let's be honest. Their function in the game is to die on the player's swords. That's really why they're there.
Right.
And so they want to sort of like present these things as monstrous entities that you're just supposed to slay out of hand. But at the same time, like if you look at the Caves of Chaos module, there's like this thing where like, okay, you go into this one room and here's all the orc warriors and you fight them and you kill them. And then you go into the next room and there's their mates and they're young. And you're like, what did we just, what did we just do now? So already the sort of like the problems of alignment start showing there. And this is kind of where I wanted to sort of like take a moment to talk about, like the problem that you have with sort of like the idea of monsters versus the idea of people, which is something that's in my alignment book that I take some time to sort of go over there.
Okay, because I read your, like I said, I read the alignment book, and you do go into this, and it was fascinating to me because you do point out that this whole thing you were talking about, because this is a battle game, it makes sense that you have to assume a certain moral agreement that it's going to be okay to slay things, or else we're going to have to break down over every kill and say, okay, what does this mean to us as a person? And that got me thinking on this subject about a couple things. Like, one, do you believe that having this space to sort of do that is a positive thing? First of all,
yeah, I do. I know that I get my own aggressions out when I play I'm playing role playing games or war games like that. I am a pretty chill guy, in my day to day life. But one of the reasons I like playing orcs in war games is because that gives me a chance to sort of like be really hyper aggressive and jump around and beat my chest and as I'm rolling dice and whatnot. And so that it's sort of like a release valve. I think it can be a positive thing as long as everybody remembers what we're doing here. One of the things I talk about in the book is about how a lot of these games, the sort of like morality of these games is not modern morality. It's all based in a sort of a very, very pre-Enlightenment, sort of like old school morality. That's you could call it heroic morality in the Greek tragedy sense of heroic, and that it's not like it's not about being like, if you look at like the heroes of ancient mythology that are sort of like the foundation of a lot of our myths, they're not nice guys. A lot of them, Achilles. And Odysseus, Cuchulainn, the Thor's kind of an asshole. He's a lovable asshole, but he's still kind of an ass. And in these tales, there's there's murder, there's oath breaking, and it's the heroism for ancient mythology isn't about saving the day. The heroism is about doing extraordinary things. That's what makes you a hero. In ancient mythology, it's not about being good, it's about being exceptional. And that sort of like Iron Age mythology, that sort of approach to morality, which is very tribal and very aggressive and very much might makes right in a lot of ways. We don't you can't, that's not modern life. You can't have that be modern life. And, so these games give us a chance to sort of like examine that kind of thinking where we can indulge our hindbrain, our cultural memory of this kind of, because all of our stories, even look at superhero stories today, action movies, are not John Wick's not a good guy. But we like to see John Wick beat up on worse guys because that's a certain, that there's that sort of like taps into that old idea of the drama of an extraordinary person doing extraordinary things.
Well, it's easier too. In the world that we face today, where we have political battles, we have climate change battles, we have discrimination battles. These aren't things that we can punch out with our fists, but which is why it's great to go watch Captain America punched Thanos out, because it's like he's punching climate change and politics and everything that we want to solve with just our meaty hands and our willpower and our heroism.
Obviously, you don't have to dive this deep into the psychology and the morality. That's, it's interesting. I think it's good to look at those things, to ask those questions. Ultimately, we just want to have fun, playing the game. But
that brings up my second question, which is if they understood this, and I think they did in exactly the way you're talking about, and in some way they also knew we just want to have fun. We just want to relive the Battle of Helm's Deep. Why did they create an alignment system? Like what was because that muddies the waters. I'm like, oh, I get it. Okay, orcs are evil. You're the heroes. You're just going to slay them. And then they're like, but when you do so, you take one step towards the lawful evil alignment. I'm like, oh no.
And this gets back to the whole monsters versus people thing, right? Because in the game, as it has developed over time, it's expected that you're going to face some creatures that are monsters, and you're going to encounter some creatures that are people. And there is a different approach for each of them. And I think it's very important for a GM to make sure that the players know this is a monster, this is a person, here are the differences between them. And, a monster isn't always something that's like an evil slavering horror. A monster can also be something that is so good and incorruptible that you can't negotiate with it because its intelligence is too alien for you to relate to. And it's going to cause problems for you as well. You can have monsters that are, angelic celestial beings just as much as you can have, evil demonic beings as well. And I think this sort of like also moves a little bit into where, sort of like the development of orcs kind of like shows the more as time goes on, people start to have more nuanced thoughts about alignment. And that changes the way orcs are, sort of like portrayed and brought into and thought about. So if we want to take our next step in the evolution of the orcs, that moves on to probably my favorite iteration, which is Games Workshop's orcs. And this is Games Workshop leaned all the way into orcs are monsters. Orcs are not people. They are a ridiculously tough, weird scourge on civilization. And so there's sort of like two versions in that milieu. There's sort of the fantasy version and the space orc version. They very much.
And you're talking, just for our fans, you're talking Warhammer.
Yes, we're talking Warhammer now. So This is sort of like we've gone from we've gone from Tolkien to D&D. Now we're into Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. And I love what GW did with the orcs of Warhammer 40K, because they made them. They are full on monsters. They are not. Like, you can't reason with an orc. You can't negotiate with an orc. The orc just wants to beat the living snot out of you because that's its idea of fun and a good time. Like, that's the orc's idea of being polite. It's going to beat your brains in with a sharp, choppa. That's its way of saying hello. Hi, we're both here on the battlefield. I'm going to stomp you into jelly.
Congratulations on your new job.
Yes, exactly. Congratulations, we get to fight, And I want to talk a little bit more later on, go more into depth on these guys, because I think that this approach is, allows for maximum fun for me. Again, other people will look at it differently, and other people have different approaches. Everybody's orcs are different, just like everybody's elves are different. But for me, like the sort of like 40K style orcs provide maximum fun because they are very alien and weird, and they are horrifying, but they are also very funny guys because they have such an unabashed joy in violence and just like their skewed, ridiculous view of everything in the world, which makes them such a scourge. But they are like the happiest race in 40K, right? Like 40K is all Sturm and Drang and grim, dark, and awfulness. The orcs are the only guys in 40K who are having fun, because they don't care if they win or lose. Like if the orc beats you to a pulp and defeats you, yeah, that's great, we won. If the orc gets sort of like beaten back and somehow gets forced to retreat, it's like, yeah, I survived, I can come back and fight you again. And if the orc, gets its head chopped off and is destroyed, the orc's like, yeah, I went down fighting, it's a win. It's like they always...
Well, they kind of had to do this, right? Because I mean, one of the interesting things that is D&D, while people have definitely played orcs as monster variants, they don't have they have a half-orc class, but they've never had like an official, like, starting out player orc class. And in Warhammer, I believe they don't have an alignment system.
No.
But they did have everything's all that's the one alignment.
There's
terrible.
no good guys, so there's no need for an alignment in Warhammer.
But what you did have was players now could play the orcs. So it was no longer, we're going to fight the orcs that are controlled by the DM, but he controls the world and everything. It's now a player is going to have to be these guys. So you had to provide some way for the player to connect, right? You had to have something that made them not just, monsters and the bad guys, and they should be the losers every time, because that's not fun to play. Right. But if you're playing the guys who are just like the brawlers,
exactly.
Now you're having fun.
So like we'll sort of like, I'm going to come back to that style of orc in a minute, because I do want to sort of like at least cover what I consider sort of like the last step, which is sort of the and this kind of comes back to what you were talking about with the Forgotten Realms orcs, about how they settle down and they become another faction that has that are not monsters anymore. They sort of become rehabilitated into people again. And that happens, I think that it happens in a lot of places, but most notably, I think most people's experience with it would be like with Warcraft, with World of Warcraft specifically, with the Horde and whatnot. I don't have a lot of experience with that because I never played World of Warcraft. I've sort of like culturally, through cultural osmosis, I've sort of like absorbed a little bit of it. I do want to mention, though, that like sort of like Warcraft comes out of originally Warcraft and StarCraft were going to be GWI, Games Workshop IP games. They were going to be ports over. They were going to be based on Warhammer Fantasy and 40K IP. The licensing got messed up at some point during the process. Again, there are people who know a lot more about it than I do and can explain it better. But they had already developed the game, and so what they basically did is they reskinned it, and it became Warcraft and StarCraft, and then later on World of Warcraft. And in the process of that reskinning, everything changed. And if you have more experience, please.
Yes. I mean, what I can say is that actually in the early days of Warcraft, orcs started off very much as the bad guys, much as we've talked about that they were in Lord of the Rings in the early days of Dungeons and Dragons. But by Warcraft 3, which is where most people consider the real turning point for Warcraft as a story telling device and as a world building exercise, you had begun to have the orcs develop their own culture, and they actually have a very similar background to the Forgotten Realms, where a portal is opened to their homeworld by the creator races. This is literally, I'm copying the script.
Yeah. I know, but you get orcs everywhere.
Well, and what we learn here is that creator races suck. I mean, come on, those guys mess everything up. It's always perfect, and then they're like, let's open a portal. But the orcs come through. They are sort of tricked. And this also ties back to D&D a little bit. One question that popped up on the forum or on the Twitch while we were talking about this was orcs are sort of driven by their religion. Is that not true? And it's true. In Dungeons and Dragons, the religion, the pantheon for the orcs really is important to them. It dictates kind of how they survive. And so whether you take it as real gods or not, they create important cultural lessons. Like there's a god that tells them to go procreate so that their race will grow and survive. There's a god that tells them to, divide the infected off from the rest of the horde. There's a god that tells them to always conquer and treat everything as enemies because that's how they stay out of danger. So their gods are very, very important. And Warcraft sort of does the same things, only the gods are actively tricking them to use them in their own fight to take over Azeroth. And so the orcs became this very sort of misunderstood, sympathetic race. And without spoilers for the games, they end up really being saved by the player. That's kind of one of the goals of the players, to save the orcs and redeem them. And by the time you enter World of Warcraft, you're kind of playing in that field where the orcs have been redeemed and now they're trying to find their place in the world. And I think, I was looking up data on this, I think that they are the most popular race to
As
play
they should
in
be.
World of Warcraft.
Yeah, no, they are. I remember hearing that before.
And maybe it has to do with that. Maybe it has to do with that redemption factor. But that's just an aside to go into the Warcraft, that kind of world. You said there is Morgan, did you, or Kavan, did you have anything to throw in here?
Well, I think it's interesting. There's part of that process of the redemption arc, or the humanization of the orc race, both in Warcraft but also in D&D, comes from letting the players play as them. Because in the early Warcraft games, you are the humans, but at some point you jump over and you play a couple levels as the orcs, and you're building the orc army, and then you jump back and you're playing the humans again. And this is like Warcraft 2. And I think that's sort of part of what puts you into the mindset of like, oh, they're not just like a monster. Like, they're building a town and they're raising pigs and they have a mission that they're working on and they have goals. And like you embody those goals. And the same with like allowing you to be a PC orc or half orc characters. Like all of a sudden now you're like, okay, well, what's my purpose? Like, why am I doing whatever it is I'm doing? As soon as you have that thought, you then have ideas of like culture and motivation. And yeah, I wanted to ask you, Robert, like it sounds like you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like kind of like you don't like the humanization, like it's the nuance of having to ask sort of those questions like with the orcs. Like you prefer them to be more of the adversarial or just like the straight enemy because it's a little cleaner. Maybe like at least that's the read I was getting from
in a
from
way.
what you were
Yes,
saying.
in a way, yes. There are. It's not like what I think I prefer is I really love Warhammer Orcs. So in my campaign, I lean into the orcs as monsters, and for instance, in my own like homebrew stuff, which I do because I'm like the king of homebrew. There are other demi-humans who I present as people, for instance, like gnolls. For instance, I run gnolls as people, but I run orcs as monsters. So like you can negotiate with a gnoll, you can't negotiate with an orc. And that provides some contrast there. And it gives the players sort of like different avenues to do different things. And if and if things ever get in the lull and, something needs to happen, I'll follow Matt Colville's famous advice, orcs attack. This is two word advice for all GMs.
There you go.
Orcs attack. That's all you need to know.
This is nice. It fits in with what Ari Marmel was talking about with the mind flayers of like, it's important to have an enemy that is an enemy so that you can sort of balance out everything else against it. Not losing that necessarily.
Yeah. And the orcs can also be really, really entertaining, for the players and the GM if you use them the way, at least they're very entertaining for me. I find them very entertaining when you don't take them 100% seriously, that they are just a little bit. It's the weirdness factor that I think GW introduced, and we can talk a little bit about that now if you want, and because
Well, just to make sure I didn't had cut you off a little earlier. You said there was like a fourth age or iteration?
Yeah,
of this,
I think that's the
right?
sort of like Warcraft iteration that you were talking
Gotcha.
about. Yeah.
And that's the final iteration.
Sort of like the humanization of orcs. Where orcs are.
Okay.
It's that famous. There's a famous line in Star Trek VI. I don't know how famous it is anymore. I don't know. I'm an old guy, so I have only old pop culture references to draw on. But where like Kirk and Spock are having a conversation, and Kirk is talking about they're talking about the Klingons, right? And Spock says something about the finding common ground, and Kirk mentions something about the the humanity of people, and Spock says something along the lines of, that's insulting. I am not a human. He says something about humanity, and Spock says, well, as you know, Captain, I am not human. And Kirk, sort of like in a moment of like lampshading, breaking the fourth wall, he says, you know what, Spock? Everybody's human, which is basically the conceit of Star Trek. And Spock, of course, is like, that's insulting, sir. So.
Well, and Klingons are essentially space orcs, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. Exactly. Klingons are
the honor of war.
Yes.
Yeah.
But where I think that the GW orcs and at least the way that I run them make is different is that it's not so much about the honor of war, because orcs don't have honor. It's the joy of war, the almost, and this is going to sound, again, this is getting into the weird part. All right. Orcs are super weird about violence. All right. So let's talk about orc psychology. In terms of sort of
I'm ready for this. Okay, I'm ready for this.
Orc physiology and psychology from.
Where was this class in college?
This is.
I took one on vampires and Russian folklore. So
there you go.
You just got to find the right professor, man.
So let's look at a Games Workshop orc, which is sort of like the same as their space orc. So first of all, they're humanoid, but they're not mammals. Okay, they don't have gender. They don't reproduce sexually. They're basically sort of a hybrid fungus creature. That literally that reproduces with spores that get spread everywhere, and then they get into the ground, and then after some time they develop and they pop out as orcs. And it's not just seriously. Yeah.
Well, that I just have been for a minute to compare that to the Faerun orc, because that's so different from, the Faerun orc, the Dungeons and Dragons orc is a very mammalian creature with very, sex is sex amongst their culture. And it actually is a little uncomfortable because early on, in the earliest editions, they basically are like, well, orcs rape.
Yeah.
It's essentially what
that's
they say.
You get half orcs in old school D&D. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they explain that very blithely.
Mm-hmm.
This was 40 years ago.
There's a squick factor there. There really is.
There's a squick factor, yeah. And even D&D 5 isn't quite sure how to navigate that because it's become such an important part of the Faerun orc that they still include it. And then they kind of throw in this line of like, but they're not like mean about it. I'm like, what? but that's such an interesting approach, just a way to sort of negate that entirely.
Yeah. So like this, again, you're never going to meet an orc mate. You're never going to meet an orc, kid. Right. They're just they pop out of the ground ready to fight. The very first thing they do is they look for something to kill or eat, when they pop out of the ground. And it's not just the orcs. So this is the other thing. This is something that I have brought into my own game. So like in Games Workshop, the orcs are basically just sort of like the main line fighters of an entire, and they're an engineered species. That's the other thing. They're not a naturally evolved species. They're an engineered species. Those damn creator races, again, this is like what they call, the old ones, which the orcs, I think the orcs refer to them as the old brain boys, because orcs are very, very simple, very direct. So like the orcs are part of like a hierarchy of sort of like these subspecies. So first you get the orc fungus, which sort of like grows on the ground. Then out of that, you get snotlings, which are like really, really tiny little orclings that mostly just tend the fungus and serve as, because the fungus is like the source of the orc spores. It's also food for the orcs and all of the other things that the orcs eat. And so the snotlings tend the fungus farms, and the orcs eat the fungus and the snotlings, of course. And then above the snotlings, you have the goblins, or in 40K they're called Gretchen, which are sort of like orcs, but like cowards, right? So a goblin is basically a coward that has all the aggression and awfulness and like, urge to violence of an orc with none of the bravery. And so like a goblin will want to stick you in the back with an arrow from like 50 yards away, where an orc wants to get up and just like stove your head in, and a goblin wants to shoot you in the back from behind a tree, right? And then jump around with me like, yeah, I got him, kind of thing. And the goblins are very responsible, and the goblins and Gretchen are responsible for sort of like simple tools and like infrastructure and doing things for the orc, like basically being servants for the orcs, and food occasionally as well, because everything in this it's everything that's bigger eats everything that's smaller in this particular ecosystem. And then above the goblin / Gretchen, you've got the orcs, who again burst out of the ground and are hyper violent, hyper aggressive, and are they have I don't know if you've heard the expression war or war, which is like the battle cry of the orcs is kind of like aloha for orcs. It means hello, goodbye, I'm going to kill you, let's go get them. It's like, it's one of their sort of like signature phrases. It also refers to when, you get a whole bunch of them moving in the same direction at once, they all shout war, and they go in.
So you think that you can, as a DM, say for like Dungeons and Dragons or any game with orcs, you would kind of say lean into this monster aspect, just play, because that's what makes them fun, is what you're saying. That's kind of going back to when you said, Helm's Deep, it's our Waterloo and all of that. Like, you think this redemption aspect of the orcs has sort of allowed us not to have fun with Helm's Deep anymore. Yeah. Because it's hard if you're thinking about the orcs that we're slaughtering in the thousands as being anything but monsters.
In a way, absolutely, because as Kavan said, it's a lot less clean, right, in terms of like having fun at the game. Even in my campaign, all right, where orcs are irredeemable monsters, I have, like, in my current campaign that I'm running for my kids, there's one of the players is working very, very hard. He's playing a high level wizard now. He's like a 14th level wizard. He's been working very, very hard to redeem the orcs and get them and sort of like free them from their biological determinism, to make them people. Yes. And it has provided a wealth of role play opportunities. Let me tell you, it's actually, I don't know if you want to get into that, but they basically, I had to come up with a reason that why the orcs are so aggressive and to figure out if there was a way for him to sort of like break that aggressive chain. And here's one of the other things. Again, this is another thing which I've ported over from Games Workshop orcs, which I thought was really cool, is that orcs in 40K generate like a psychic field among themselves. All right. That is, the more you have of them in one place, the more powerful it is. And that's where you get orc shamans from, because they're like, they call them the weird boys. And the weird boys basically manifest these weird psychic abilities that mostly involve blowing things up with their brains. Until the point where they get too much wah, and then they blow their own brains up and take out, all the guys around them. But that's another thing. But this psychic field that the orcs have, increases their aggression, makes them, meaner, helps get them organized. And also which is one of the funny things about which I love, is that it allows their technology to work, because like an orc weapon, like if anybody else were to pick it up, it's too heavy, it's unwieldy, it doesn't work right. It's just a collection of stuff glommed together. It looks like a piece of junk. But in the hands of an orc, his belief is so strong and reinforced by that psychic field that it is an effective weapon in his hands, right? And like things like there's actually a rule in 40K that if you have like an orc truck or something like that, if it's painted red, it gets an extra inch of movement, because orcs believe that red ones go faster.
I love this. I love the thought that you could hand an orc like a totally radioactive, just ready to blow up device, and just be like, this is going to be fine.
Yes,
go.
Exactly.
Exactly. They're totally good. And it does. It ends up working out. The power of orc faith.
Yeah. And in fantasy, in fantasy, it's like orc catapults are these like ridiculous things that look like giant slingshots or whatnot. If anybody else tried to use it, it would implode on itself and like destroy everybody who was trying to work it, right? But the orcs somehow, because of their faith and they have their gods Gork and Mork, who are their two, so like the twin orc brothers who, they worship. And, you can tell the difference between them, because Mork is cunning but brutal, and Gork is brutal but cunning. And that's so again, this is like the level of seriousness we're dealing with here. I just want to sort of like make that clear. An orc warband in Games Workshop 40K, when I try to explain to people like what an orc warband is, it's like a rolling, ongoing soccer riot where everybody is drunk off their ass and nobody can remember if they're rioting because the team won or because the team lost, but nobody cares.
So do you believe that all the culture, I mean, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons 5 has done a lot to, like, especially in the latest Volo's Guide, which if anybody's really interested in the best compilation of orc sort of lore from Dungeons and Dragons Forgotten Realms, Volo's Guide actually does a great job of it. It compiles pretty much everything you need to know about orcs without having to dig too far into the esoterica. And it talks about culture and, the females versus the males and, the babies and how everybody's raised and all this stuff. So do you think that the simpler is better? For
me, that's overthinking it. There are people who like that, and that's great. Like I said, everybody's orcs are different, but I prefer the orcs. Like, the orcs were originally sort of like designed as, this sort of like blunt instrument to beat the heroes with and for the heroes to triumph against, ultimately. And I like them as a blunt instrument. I like them as the big green war machine. And that just like is all about the aggression and the violence, because this is a game. Again, we're playing a game where a good portion of the game, and not all of the game, and not everybody runs their game like this way, but if you're talking Pathfinder and Dungeons and Dragons and those kind of heroic fantasy
out of the box D&D for sure.
Yeah, exactly. This is a game about killing monsters and taking their stuff.
And yet you are lawful good, sir.
Yeah, no, exactly. So the only way that works, the only way that tracks is if the monsters are monsters, right? And you don't.
Yeah. I have like the opposite take. I agree with what you're saying. That view only works if the monsters are monsters. But I really like the nuance of having to go into a cave and like you're killing the kobolds and then they're running away saying like, please don't, and you have to sit there and ask yourself like, oh wait, like, am I the murder hobo? Like, am I the bad guy here?
No, that was an aspect of that.
And I feel like people need to ask themselves that a little bit more in society. And I think that anything, especially play, that encourages you to maybe question yourself a little bit more, like, am I being a good guy here, is probably good. And I like that there's been this trend in general, like in movies and in culture and in games, to present more nuanced takes on like the evil, so that evil isn't just evil, but it's more of a gray. Exactly. So you have to like, how evil is the evil person? Why are they evil? And I feel like anything that adds a little bit of the gray to life, especially games that kids are playing, I'm kind of gung ho for. So like I understand, like, it makes it a cleaner game when you have more of a clean enemy, or a clear enemy. But I don't know. Like I appreciate the gray personally.
I'm kind of in Kavan's camp, but I do appreciate that. Like, that's part of the joy of these type of games, is that you can build a campaign specifically for what you're looking for. And if you're looking for something that's just like good versus evil, have at it, kill the enemy, go for it, and you're the victor, and that makes you good, like, then that's awesome. But if you want to have a more nuanced campaign, like, there's so much material out there for that, and that's I think why these kinds of tabletop games have become so popular in the recent upswing of them.
And I want to point to something in your book, Robert, if you don't mind for a minute, because I think it addresses this in your the very last book you'll ever need on alignment. And this is the very last podcast you'll ever need on alignment, by the way. But one of the things that you talk about in there is sort of assigning which creatures up front in as a DM you're going to make the nuanced, and which ones are going to make the monsters. And I really liked that advice in the book, because you didn't say in your book, orcs can never be good. You didn't say, or nuanced. You didn't say that. But what you did say is you need to communicate to your players which sort of creatures you're going to have civilization,
right,
and which ones are going to be, bloodthirsty, just animalistic, monsters. If you want the Bahirs in your campaign to be very sympathetic, misunderstood creatures, you can do it. But choosing that beforehand and knowing these are the monsters I'm going to play with, and then saying, but in this campaign, orcs are just monsters, and going with that really sets a nice playing field for the players to have fun, but also explore nuance.
Yeah, I do think that you need a mix of both in a campaign. I think that if I was running a campaign where the orcs were the only enemy, and they were just like this, never-ending churning, green-skinned tide that's gonna, rush at the borders of civilization constantly, that would be boring. That would not be a productive game, and that would get boring really quick. And also, definitely there needs, like, Kavan, I do agree with you that there needs to be that kind of nuance in games. But I think it depends on, a lot of it depends on who your players are and what their preference is. And as always, the most important thing is communication between the GM and the players, so that everybody is at the same sort of level of comfort with, how you're playing with these concepts. And like, again, as I was saying, I have this player in my kids' campaign who has wanted to, I laid out at the beginning, orcs are monsters, and he, it didn't work for him. And so, it's like in improv, yes, and yes, but, yes, therefore. So, he was like, okay, yes, but I'm going to find a way to free the orcs. And then they wind up, all right. So this is kind of interesting, right? All right. All right.
Story time.
Story time. Okay. Story time. Rob tells you about his campaign. This wizard, when he, there was a part of the adventure where they were in the wilderness in a place that was a ruined kingdom that had been taken over by orcs and giants and trolls and ogres and whatnot. And so they're in this region that's heavily infested with. So they fought a lot of orcs for a little while because the giants were using the orcs as shock troops, basically. And over the course of this wizard is like, he keeps trying to talk and negotiate with the orcs, right? With which the orcs respond to with violence, because that's what they do. He decides that he needs to do an in-depth study. So he gets specimens, he looks at stool samples, he finds out about the fungus, because like nobody else knew about the fungus until he researched it, right? So his player gets to be the first to find out about the fact that orcs are, made of fungus, and he analyzing the spores and learning about the psychic. He's the first one to find out about the psychic field that the orcs share, and the fact that their aggression, they're like antennas that for aggression that's coming in from outside. Well, where is it coming from? And he's like researching, well, the mythology is that like the gods, Gork and Mork, are the ones that are broadcasting this aggression to all of the orcs around the world. And he figures out that if he can create this sort of like ritual space in which Gork and Mork's avatars are summoned and then defeated, there's a way to sort of like break the chain. If you can break the chains binding Gork and Mork, then the orcs will, be free, kind of like to be people. But what it is they'll be free of their aggression. Basically, it's the aggression that drives the orcs and goblins to do what they do. So he immediately starts putting the wheels in motion to create the ritual space that is going to happen, where this is going to happen. And to create the ritual, a whole mess of orcs have to be brought into, this space. And there has to be a battle because it's orcs, so it all has to be violence focused. And there has to be a shaman and who's channeling the great green that is being generated by all of these orcs, and that's going to summon Gork and Mork if it's done in this particular way. So he starts the process of like building this space where this ritual is going to happen. He's doing it up near where all the orcs are, so to make sure that he can draw them in. And then in the process of that, he's researching it. He's finding out about why the orcs were created to put a check on civilization. He starts to have doubts about, is this a good idea? Is this maybe I shouldn't do this. Maybe there's something that maybe there's a reason for this. So he goes like in the middle of he hires a bunch of workmen. Then the whole party's in on this, right? So they're all working as a unit on this. They're behind him 100%. So they hire a bunch of workmen to start creating this temple. And while they're doing that, we're just going to go over here and do this quest to meet these ancient sages who are going to tell us, who supposedly set all this up millennia ago. And we're going to find out from them if this is a good idea or not, which leads to them going into the Underdark. And long story short, they're gone for like 2 months, on this side quest, during the course of which they are thinking, maybe it's not a good idea. Maybe we shouldn't do this. Maybe we're messing with things we don't understand yet. Maybe we need to do more research. But because they built the thing, when there was a point where it's like, okay, you get a message from somebody who lives near here, from a officiant of the kingdom near which you have built this thing, saying, hey, did you do this? Because there's a lot of orcs here now and we don't know what's going on. So they rush over there, and sure enough, their temple, it's like, if you build it, they will come, right? The orcs have all showed up. The ritual's in full swing. It's totally out of control. Gork and Mork are summoned, and there was just like, I guess we're doing this, right? They, again, I didn't force them into it. I just first they tried to stop the ritual. They failed to stop the ritual. Then Gork and Mork sort of like avatars appear, and they've got chains that are binding them, into the earth, right? And the wizard's like, yes, all right, no, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's free Gork and Mork. Let's break these chains. So they figure out they need to break the chains. And so they break the chains. Big, explosion of psychic energy. The orcs are all sort of like blown away. And then the thing that the orcs were siphoning the rage from emerges from the ground. And it's the Tarrasque.
Oh, nice. A good way to summon up the Tarrasque.
Yes, exactly. Because it's a high level campaign. I had the idea that I was going to bring in the Tarrasque at some point, but so that's the focus of the campaign now. Is, oh crap! So we freed the orcs. We have to stop the Tarrasque.
I had a question. My question was about the design of orcs for you, Robert, because one thing that I noticed, and I'm going to pull up a picture here. For the listeners, what I'm going to be looking at is a picture of the 4 kind of versions of orcs that had been.
Oh God!
Yeah, well, starting with Alf, as I call it, Alf down there.
That's so weird.
And you see changes. You see the artwork become more refined. Is really what you see, but you don't see the creature really change that much. And even in Warhammer, where you describe they're kind of a totally different thing. It's like a plant monster almost. They don't change. They don't look very different. And Lord of the Rings, the movie, doesn't look very different. And, every Warcraft looks totally like these guys. Orcs have just not seemed to change in design across the genres, across the ages. What do you think that is? Is it
Well, it's kind of unfortunate, really, but I think that a lot of it has to do with how the sort of like, I don't know, Northwestern European idea of what makes an ugly, brutish person has gotten sort of like translated over to the orcs. So you see sloping foreheads and big jaws and stooped shoulders but the idea is like it's really sort of like that sort of Victorian idea of what a savage looks like, kind of thing. That I think that's one of the things that sort of, at least initially, has sort of defined the look of orcs. I think GW has sort of like by their orcs, they're still sort of like part of that, but by making them just a little bit more crazy and giving them their own kind of spin in terms of like the way that they present them as like highly, highly exaggerated, aggressive creatures. They're like orcs can be really cartoony, I guess is what I'm saying. You think it
satirizes it a little bit.
I think that, and I think orcs are better when they're a little cartoony, when you don't take them seriously, because they are not as a concept. Orcs are not a forward-thinking, enlightened trope to play with. They're just not. They're just like, they're brutal warriors to be terminated with extreme prejudice. That's in at least in sort of like very, very basic concept. Let's even break it down. Let's not even get that sophisticated. Orcs are bad guys. All right. That is that is what is an orc. An orc's a bad guy. That's all it really comes down to. So, and again, if you, and like Kavan was talking, if you make them more nuanced, if you make them people, they're not really the bad guy anymore. Are they still an orc? Yeah, they're still an orc because we have all this other tropes and all this other sort of like, little quirky stuff that we've sort of glommed on to it. But at its heart, the orc's purpose in terms of like as in dramatic function, let's say the dramatic function of an orc is to be a bad guy. And even the good orcs have sort of like that sort of like shadow, that heritage looming over them in the fiction and whatnot.
So you're saying almost that if they are good guys, then we kind of have to examine these other uncomfortable things about them. Like why are they designed this way? Why do they look this way? Why is their culture one of rape and slavery?
Yeah. It's again, like it literally, the whole thing starts to break down. If you look at it too closely, the whole thing starts to fall apart, which is, again, why I think that they're better as a very cartoony kind of exaggerated goofball fantasy concept. And again, you could do this with orcs. You could do it with gnolls.
Right. Kobolds.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that makes orcs different is like kobolds they look like animals, right? They look dragony, they look lizardy, lizard men. They look like lizards, giant alligators. I think, and this goes all the way back to Tolkien, when he made his orcs humanoid, you're stuck because there is at some point you're going to empathize with these creatures and wonder.
There's also a lot of, there's been a fair amount of cultural critique on the way that orcs were described, like slanted eyes and other sorts of physical characteristics that were given, and that they were also made out to be sort of like the tribal savages, in line with like a lot of basic descriptions of like Mongol warriors and like all that region of the world. And so there's definitely there's a reason why I feel like there's been a push to make them as like exaggerated and comical as possible, is to sort of separate it from the kind of the cultural grounding that might be a little, or maybe more than a little, insensitive or kind of sketchy.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I agree with that. I completely agree with that.
And Tolkien himself complicated this, right? Because he has a chapter in his, or a scene where two orcs kind of chat in Return of the King, and are sort of like
there's a couple like that. Yeah, no, there's it's the one where they're fighting over the mithril shirt. Is the one we're talking about?
Yeah.
I think like one of them is like, this really sucks. Like this more sucks, and we'd like to go home sometime. And suddenly you're like, oh, where's home for these guys? What does after the war look like for them?
Yeah, it's really weird, especially when you think of like the way the orcs are portrayed and as the goblins in The Hobbit as well, where, they live underground in caves. It's all, sort of like violent and dirty and grimy and whatnot and awful. I don't know. I don't know that anybody really has the answers to these questions. I do know that, like I said, when you look at it too closely, the construct, frays at the edges and starts to fall apart, and it becomes something else. And maybe you want to explore that, and that's cool. There's no wrong way to in my opinion, there's really, I don't know. I don't want to make blanket statements, but I don't think there's
everybody brainstorm wrong ways to portray the Go.
I mean, if you want to like attach human cultural signifiers onto orcs and make them irredeemable savages, then yes, that's problematic too. But and in some ways, that's their origin story, right?
Right.
So how do you make that less problematic? You can either, like Games Workshop did, you can either take it in a completely weird direction and remove all human cultural signifiers from the orcs, so they are completely, truly alien race that have nothing in common with us. Or you can humanize them.
Or you can be Warcraft. Like Tolkien and say, I don't do allegory.
Yeah. There we go.
Oh.
Well, I have what I call the gauntlet, where I do this with guests sometimes. I like to run them through like a series of quick questions with just quick answers off the top of, off the cuff kind of stuff.
Oh, it's going to be hard. I'm like, my kids know that I'm like Mr. Context. So like,
I'll cut you off. I'll cut you off.
Right.
I'll be that guy.
Right.
Before I launch into that, I did want to check with Kavan. Morgan, did you have any follow up to what things we said or things from the Twitch that we should cover real quick?
No, I think everybody's just kind of been listening. Me personally, I only know them as the stereotype. So, I'm only sort of aware of Warhammer and sort of aware. So this was just been a lot of fun information for me to absorb. So thank you.
There is one more thing that
Yes.
I did want to touch on,
Yes.
because it would be terrible if I went this whole thing without mentioning this.
I won't cut you off on this one. Go.
Okay, this is the relationship between orcs and dwarves.
Oh,
All right?
please. Yes.
All right.
Okay.
So, and actually, there's two things we can mention. First, I'll talk about the relationship between wargs and goblins, right?
Okay.
So this is something that I think people sometimes. I have a take, so I want to put this take out into the world, right? Goblins, we see goblins riding on wargs, right? So we think, oh yes, well the goblins have tamed the wargs to act as their mounts. But if you look at the stats, the wargs are smarter, faster, and more aggressive than the goblins. So I think we are getting that relationship wrong. I think it's the wargs who have tamed the goblins to act as their hands. So that's one thing. That's just like a little goofy thing to put out there. And the other thing is orcs and dwarves. Dwarves hate the orcs. The orcs come in, they occupy the same geographical areas, they wreck their holds, they kill their fellows, they drink their beer, they burn their creations, they despoil their lands. The dwarves hate the orcs so much, and this is such a tragedy, because I believe, at least for my orcs, if the orcs really love violence and really love a good fight, the orcs love the dwarves. That's why they keep coming back. They want, the dwarves are so tough and so hard to kill that the orcs are like, oh my God, these guys are a challenge. We are going to be showing up. We'll be back next year, man. You guys are awesome. And the dwarves
See
are
you
like,
later.
oh, yes. All right.
They're your best fans. They're the biggest
Exactly.
fans. That's amazing.
Mhm.
Oh, all right. Here
All
comes
right.
the gauntlet. You ready?
Yep.
Number 1, your favorite orc encounter in an RPG.
Okay. Any place where the orcs outnumber the party and like are just like coming at them, and then something comes out of the cave or out of the they bring out, here's the
cave troll.
here's
Yeah.
the ogre, like this, like when they think that when you think you've got them flattened, and then they bring out their big buddy.
Right. So that scene in in Fellowship of the Ring where they bust in.
Exactly. They have the
Moria.
cave troll. Yes,
That's great. Okay. Have you ever died to an orc? And just name one time.
I've died as an orc many times.
In Warhammer,
my
of course.
My Warhammer orcs were never terribly successful on the tabletop, but you know what? But I never had as much fun, getting beaten in a game as I have with the orcs.
All right, we're gonna get a little harder now. Your other favorite horde monster.
Ooh, other favorite horde monster. Ooh, orcs are my go-to horde monster, and I say orcs and goblins together. So it would have to be something like the Tyranids in 40K,
Oh, right.
Which is like the bug swarm type of
Zerglings
thing.
kind of thing.
Yeah,
okay,
basically. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm a fan of Zerg rushing. That's my favorite tactic.
It's a fun one to watch. Your favorite appearance of orcs in the fantasy genre, other than Warhammer and D&D and Warcraft, the big ones.
Wow, probably the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies. I'll just say that.
Okay,
they're pretty iconic now.
They're pretty iconic now, yeah.
And speaking of that, favorite Lord of the Rings orc moment.
Ooh, favorite Lord of the Rings orc moment. Probably in the movies, in the film adaptation of Return of the King, where they're launching the masonry off of the parapets of Gondor, and this huge thing comes up, and there's Bolg, the orc general, and he's watching the thing come in, and he just takes like one step to the right while the thing crushes all of his men standing right next to him, and he just kind of like turns around and like calls for more guys.
I think he spits on it.
Something like that. Yeah.
All right. Best orc unit in Warhammer, in your opinion?
Ooh. You know what? No, I can answer this unequivocally. It's the basic orc boy. Because I love horde armies, right? And you can put a shield, like you can give them upgrades and whatnot. As far as I'm concerned, the best upgrade for a basic orc boy is another basic orc boy standing right next to him. You just line them up, stack them deep, sell them cheap, push them forward, and do the Zulu horns of the bull tactic. Get around. No flanks. We don't have flanks. We go from one end of the board to the other. You're not getting past us. We are going to surge forward and just like wash over you like a green tide.
All right. You're doing good so far. Now we're going to step it up one more step.
All right.
Here we go. Scariest thing to crossbreed an orc with.
Ooh, a human.
Okay. There you go.
That's funny because like I had a character, like even with my orcs being like fungus creatures and whatnot, they don't reproduce sexually. I did have a player in one game want to play a half orc. So, again, it's yes and. So I said, okay, you can play a half orc, but you're like the result of an experiment by a crazy wizard.
Yeah, too much foot fungus, and that's what happened.
Something like that. Yeah, but basically, he was created by a weird wizard to try and like, to try and negotiate with the orcs, and it was total failure. So now he's got to live with the humans.
Little backstory to this one. There is an orc in this game who wants to run a coffee shop. He's a good guy. Just wants to run a coffee shop. And he hires you to do the advertising. How the heck do you get people in the door?
You hire a troll to stand outside in the street and literally throw them through the door.
Yes! 2 points. That's great. All right. Your player.
And then the orc literally throws full pots of coffee at people. And then there's a goblin that after they're knocked unconscious, the goblin picks the money out of their pocket and puts it in the register.
I think why don't they do this? And it's basically the Starbucks model.
Very effective.
There you go.
Your players tell you they want you to run an orc, like a game that's going to use orcs as like the ultimate bad guys. How do you make them scary in this game?
Oh, my orcs can be. What's scary about my orcs is that they don't stop, and that and this is one of the, again, this is sort of like a weird little like biology quirk that I borrowed from 40K, is that the spores that create more orcs are released from the orcs through violence. So violence for them is the way they reproduce. It's like, that's why they love it so much, because it feels so good. And that freaks people out when they learn that. That's
what I am going to do, just because you said something interesting there. I want to have a quick DM question for you, follow up, because a lot of our listeners are new time DMs or people who want to get into DMing. And one question that comes up sometimes is like, when you take a horde creature like this, how do you keep, you can throw more and more and more at the party, but sometimes that just makes the party like go, okay, we got to kill more of these things. Or, oh, you're just throwing more at us until we die, huh? How do you change the attitude from that to, oh, I'm scared. This is this is Helm's Deep. How do you make it, how do you play that line between mechanics and actually I'm scared, right now?
One of the ways, I think I have a little bit of an advantage as a wargamer because I have tons and tons and tons of orc and goblin miniatures from Warhammer. So when I set up a battlefield, like the party is always in the middle of the map, right? And here's the orcs on one side of the map. And then just like every round, I bring in a few more orcs or a few more goblins. And they're cutting them down, but they keep the fact that orcs are coming from over here now, or they're coming from over here now, or they're coming from over here now as they come in from different parts of the map. And also, like, it always starts with, there's some goblins and some orcs and maybe one big orc. And then it depends on how the encounter is structured. We did a battle with the orcs that started with, again, it was some goblins, some regular orcs, and some bigger orcs. And then as the party came in, the orc boss is there. He blows a horn, and suddenly the bigger orcs start coming, and the trolls start coming. and then like out of the cave comes the gigantic Squiggoth monster.
I'm already tired.
Yeah.
I'm done.
And then, like orc boar chariot comes rushing across the battlefield and like the party kills the orc driving it, but the chariot keeps going and slams into the party anyway. And
wow.
For me, orcs they don't necessarily. All right. So for me, it's not about making the orcs scary.
Mm-hmm.
It's about how chaotic can the battle become? Because that's what makes an orc encounter for me interesting, is that the battle needs to start with some kind of like sane look to it, but then get more and more and more out of control. Because for me, that's what orcs are. Orcs want to go as fast as possible, be as loud as possible, and destroy stuff in the most spectacular fashion possible. So it becomes a spectacle. It's not necessarily about, oh my God, it's not like, oh my God, the orcs are going to kill us. It's, oh my God, things are going to get so out of control that we can no longer manage the logistics of this fight.
Wow, I love it.
Yeah, you take the planning ability away from the players, and it kind of just goes to, we've been there a few times.
And then the fireballs start coming out, and it's like friendly, you got to deal with the friendly fire, because that's the only way to beat it.
Guys, I'm sorry, this chain lightning's going to hurt.
Exactly.
All right, my last question on the gauntlet then. Your players tell you they want you to run a campaign where the orcs are good. How do you run a good orc campaign?
Well, I mean, you just make them people instead. You like I'll lean into that trope instead of making them monsters. Again, it's all about monsters versus people. If you want good orcs, you can have good orcs. You just play them just like regular folks. In which case, maybe then you say, yes, orcs are people, but those elves are monsters. In fact, there's who is it? There's somebody who's done Simon, what's his last name? I can't remember. I know him on, I don't know him. I've seen him on Twitter. He's developing a game called like Goblins of Shadow or something like this, where the players play goblin revolutionaries in this dictatorial, totalitarian elf culture that is like oppressing the goblins. And so you're like a resistance cell of goblins fighting against the elves. So, yeah.
What I love about what you just said is another good tip for DMs is that you don't have to go off of what's in the books. And you can have a lot of fun if you could grab a creature like the orcs and just say, let's say you're playing the campaign Tomb of Annihilation, and you decide, hey, instead of the main village being human, I'm just going to change it. This city is going to be all orcs, and just make them the good guys. I love that you can take skins basically and place them in these positions, and it totally can change, as Kavan was saying, the way a player has to think about the world.
You know what, Spock? Everybody's human.
And that is the gauntlet with that. So, wow. Thank you for all those awesome answers.
Thank you. This is a lot of fun. You guys are awesome.
Hey, thank you so much. So this has
thank you for
been a
joining
blast.
Us. We appreciate it.
I don't think I have any other things. We're not going to get into our normal question about what orc meat would taste like.
I know. I was beginning to feel a little like
we're going to avoid that.
Not sure that fits.
Yeah.
Don't eat the orcs. Can only end
probably gross. I would go with the no.
Don't. If you're asked, no. Don't ask that question. Let's just stay there. Don't ask that question. So that is really the end of my list of questions. Kavan, Morganite.
I don't really have any other questions. We didn't cover a lot of like the basic orc stuff, but these are all things that people can just Google. Selective infanticide and orcs.
Their compatibilities. That kind of thing.
Orcs living for 12 years, or orcs being like mature at 12 and like dying at 26, compared to like elves living forever as sort of like that yin yang.
Yeah, it's weird. I was reading something earlier today because I was looking at some notes about there's some bits in Tolkien where Tolkien's orcs may be just as immortal as the elves are.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Like there's some orc chieftains that are like listed as like living for 150 years or more, like being around like a centuries later or something like that.
Kavan, I'd love for you to throw out your favorite bits of trivia, like top 3, top 5 that you found.
Yeah, the orcs being like the it makes sense since they're like the evil war creature, but like also they have the shortest lifespans of like any of the creatures in D&D, which is kind of crazy.
We may never know what the natural lifespan of an orc is.
Yeah, they all die. They all die in battle. Like that's like they expect to. So you have a race of people who don't have the ability to. They don't have the luxury of like planning for the future. So it kind of makes sense that like they live in the now and they're just like hyper aggressive and like they have these sort of like, I don't know, tribalistic rituals and other sorts of things. It's sort of like how they pass on their knowledge. That was interesting. Yeah, there's definitely some sketchiness in sort of like the social hierarchy. Like they don't go into it too much anymore, but they did in the earlier editions about the like females within their culture are not respected very well. And that's sort of interesting and something to kind of maybe explore within a game and get some conversations going if that's the kind of game you want to run.
There is I just want to like with regards to that in the GW milieu, like the sort of like cultural hierarchy of orcs is that like an orc will not stop growing. Like if they get bigger and bigger as time goes on, and they only stop growing when they meet another orc that basically puts them in their place. Like their hierarchy is literally about aggression. They will bully everybody around them. And as they do so, they will get bigger and bigger until they meet an orc that can bully them back. And then they stop growing. And that's where they plateau.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And then the one that bullied them obviously keeps getting bigger. So that's why the war bosses are the biggest, literally the biggest.
That would make sense.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different places to get inspiration for again, I tend to be a kind of a system neutral guy. I play D&D, Pathfinder, Call of Cthulhu, Earth Dawn, just about anything you throw at me, I'll give it a shot at least once. Rollmaster even, my God. And, yeah.
That's awesome.
The old school with all the charts. It's crazy.
Wow.
But there's so much inspiration out there to bring to your game. Not movies, books, literature, other games. Again, I'm very much in the sort of like old school homebrew everything kind of guy. Where I just pull stuff together and try and synthesize something, and it's good for your it can be good for your players because it gets to a point where like the player can't just look in the monster manual and learn they can learn the stats, but if you are pulling influences from other places, then the tactics will be different, the culture will be different, the accoutrement of the battle will be different. I don't know, that's kind of a weird way to put that, but there.
It's also a great way to break DM's block. If you are sitting staring at your adventure page going, I don't know what to do to make this interesting, pick something from another game. Make plant sprouting orcs.
Yeah. The rules are a guide, and should definitely be looked at as a guide to help someone get started. But always feel free to kind of deviate when a better game, like when fun is found elsewhere.
Well, I think that is the end of our show today. Robert, I wanted to thank you again for being a part of this. This was a blast.
I had a lot of fun.
Excellent.
Thank you, Robert.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you so much for hanging out with us for this episode of the Bestiary. It was a lot of history, and that was a lot of fun. So, Robert, thank you again for joining us. Kavan, Jonathan, as always, and we will see you all next time. See you, bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bestiary. If you would like to see more of our work, please go to alignmentmayvary.com, where you can keep up with our D&D campaign, check out interviews and DM tips, and listen to back episodes on the Bestiary. I recommend our episode on unicorns, where we find out what unicorn meat tastes like. If you like our show, please consider donating $1 a month to our Patreon. We are working on developing more content, and every dollar helps. We also would love to hear from you, so if you have a question or comment, please email that to alignmentmayvary@gmail.com. And please tune in next episode for our exploration of the mysterious Water Weird. Ooh. Take care.